You know, whether it's the stuff, the thaw, the descent, you know it's probably going to be ridiculous if it starts with the. And for some reason, as usual, I'm here to deliver on that science concerning these things, apparently. So on the 4th of July, way up in the hellscape known as Maryland, don't let the name throw you off, an outbreak of an unknown disease would begin spreading rapidly. Appearing to be associated with the water within the Chesapeake Bay itself, people would begin being covered in boils and lesions before finally succumbing to their wounds. As the CDC and doctors alike were trying to figure it out, the entire town would go dark, resulting in containment procedures being ordered and the survivors left in the town cut off. So in today's episode, we will be discussing the movie The Bay and why actually, maybe not to this extent, but I could totally see humanity being the designers of their own downfall, at least in this small town. But first, this episode is sponsored by NordVPN. It seems like every time I make these, the internet just kind of gets worse and worse, doesn't it? Well, if you're like me, then likely you want a few degrees of separation between you and the world, and NordVPN is helping you take control of the internet experience so it doesn't feel so sketch. If you head to nordvpn.com/Roanoke or click the link in the description, you can get a 2-year plan with an additional 4 months for free. My favorite part about NordVPN is the security it offers me. With my internet data staying behind a wall of encryption, double protection to change my IP twice to cover web traffic when I make inflammatory posts about why 1967 Impalas are objectively the best year of Impala, or how you can change your location to anywhere on the planet in order to bypass geographically locked content by choosing one of their over 5,400 servers in 59 different countries. So that's pretty awesome. So if you're ready to take back your internet security, then head to nordvpn.com/Roanoke or click the link in the description to get protection for 2 years with an additional 4 months free. And if you don't like it, it comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you've been thinking about it, there's really no risk for you to go ahead and check it out. But all right, let's get back to it. So up on screen, you will see a timestamp to jump to if you want to bypass a summary, but you know what's weird about this movie? Apparently it was made by the people who also made Paranormal Activity. I'm just not sure it works well with a wide open town instead of like a confined house. But apart from that, you can jump to the science portion where we will talk about how this threat grew wildly out of control. But for everyone else, let's see why you shouldn't dump thousands of tons of chicken turds into a water supply that you intend on drinking. So we start off this fun adventure into the lesion-filled movie with the news reporting. And what's interesting is these are actual news reports taken, like in real life, of thousands of fish meeting their end. It can happen a lot in times of algal blooms or certain bacteria begin growing wildly out of control within a water system, but the fish are usually a pretty good indicator of health of the water. And who eats those fish? Birds. During this report, they also begin talking about how birds are just falling out of the sky as well. You know, some real apocalypse stuff to get the juices flowing. We now see a reference to the story that we were about to see, but was never made public. So let me set this thing up. It's sort of like a found footage style. There's really no main character, but instead a whole bunch of different people getting got by the same thing. However, we meet Donna, who's an aspiring journalist, on a Skype call, getting her story out there. She has been tasked with covering the July 4th festivities in Claridge, Maryland. She's attempting now to speak about what happened during these events and how the town was affected during this time. On the morning of July 4th, everyone is pretty stoked on America. It's 2009. The world isn't entirely a flaming hellhole. I say entirely because I think 2009 was a good year. So as Donna begins covering everything going on, she starts interviewing random citizens about what's happening. Not really what's happening like bad things, just what are you doing this 4th of July? They also have a crab eating contest, which sounds awesome. Personally, I think I could wipe out an entire crab population, but she begins talking about the town's stats. It's a small town of around 6,200 people with a massive chicken farm, and the town exports it to basically keep running, and apart from that, the summer tourism is really what the town's other main income is. As she interviews the mayor of the town, she mentions about how she didn't know he was so culpable and was almost really responsible for the downfall of the entire town. But she seems pretty disgusted in hindsight. So remember, it's found footage, so it jumps around a lot. Rewind to 6 weeks before the events of the 4th, the first signs of things about to go to complete crap were already emerging. The bodies of 2 scientists were found in the bay. Problem was, however, the bite marks would seem to indicate that they were sharks attacking them, but it was on the torso and abdomen, which did not seem consistent with normal bites of the sharks that may have entered those waters. Another issue was the water is brackish, and sharks typically do not like to enter that form of water, which left a lot of rescuers stumped as to what attacked them. Ergo, their end was listed as unknown. These 2 scientists were tasked with keeping an eye on the bay. Examining some of the algae they found, this would indicate that an unnatural nutrition level has entered the water itself. So they continued their work to figure out what was going on around and near the bay. Just prior to this, citizens were actually kind of getting rather upsetty spaghetti as the mayor's company was dumping a ton of chicken turds into the bay, which was what the fishermen used to really just catch their fish. The mayor fires back saying it's not really his problem and the EPA needs to keep up with that. Now that's using the old brain case. Pass the buck, my boy. Meanwhile, some citizens don't really care about the chicken turds in the water. However, the video evidence would say there's probably way too much. The issue began to arise when the desalination plant was set up to give the chickens water and also supply the community with water as well. They assumed it was clean enough to drink, be used, and everything was good to go. But as we will find out, that's never really the case, is it? As the July 4th celebration continues, however, we begin to see things aren't going right. A woman is then seen walking down the street, bleeding from her wounds on her body, screaming that she needs help. So if you don't know about the bystander effect, it's basically when somebody asks for help, a crowd has a tendency to stand there because they don't really want to engage. So if you ever actually need help, a trick into fooling the human brain into actually getting help is you yell fire, because everybody wants to see something burn. Don't yell help, yell fire. Anyways, so the bystander effect kicks in and nobody really does help her, and she starts yelling about how finding her children and husband is important, which I imagine it would be. So basically, this doesn't look very good. Other citizens are also experiencing issues, as with a little girl who was at the lake area begins screaming for her mother, and she is transported to the hospital for her wounds. While across town, back at the crab eating contest, everyone begins throwing up, showing that across the board, the crabs were all infected with something. At the hospital, a doctor is attempting to understand what is going on with this infection. The lesions are appearing way too quickly. He calls the CDC to get a clear idea of what he's dealing with. They discuss the symptoms and attempt to see what these people may have been exposed to, and then ask if they have been treated with methicillin, because obviously MRSA would be high up on the list considering the lesions. But many of the patients also go on to say that their joints hurt and the lesions are forming all over, indicating a pretty heavy immune response to whatever is infecting them. Further in town later that day, the police end up finding someone just laying on the ground deceased. There's no evidence of any major wounds, and they really have no idea what brought this person down. While this is happening, the 911 call center starts getting overwhelmed as people are wandering through yards bleeding and acting strangely, which, as you might guess, that quickly starts to overwhelm emergency services. By 2 p.m., the cops are called in to respond to what they think is a grisly proper domestic. The woman had her guts ripped out on the lawn and her tongue appears to have been cut off. Donna is the only journalist in training on the scene and begins interviewing local people as to what sort of people lived there and why she may have been annihilated like she was. Within the hospital, a girl begins FaceTiming her friend, and we get a good look at the rash and lesions forming on the skin. Appearing to be like boils, it's a severe immune response, but getting a flashback to the scientists, they have found a fish saturated with parasites that could be an indicator as to why all these fish are floating up on the surface. The parasites appear to be attacking the gills and internal organs, and along with this, more and more people are being pulled away from the water in totally mutilated conditions with their tongues ripped out and grievous wounds all over their face and bodies. The doctor is the first to make the connection. He suggests that there is a parasite literally eating its way into people and out of their bodies. The CDC is hesitant to believe this, however, suggesting instead it's a form of Vibrio. The general idea is that the bacterial level within the water is rising, which is also confirmed by the scientists out on the lake back in June because of the chicken waste being dumped in the water. But this idea is blown away as footage of a group is fishing. As a man goes to pull his fish out of the water, a creature exits the mouth of the fish and bites the man holding it before going back into the water. In another part of a bay, a young family has rented a boat and is attempting to call their family in Claridge, but are not able to get through in any capacity. Also, we see more crap kind of going on. 2 teenagers get destroyed by something in the water. All I'm saying is, first off, you wouldn't catch me in that murky, brackish water. Also, this girl is getting attacked and this dude just jumps in. I mean, it's bold of you, bro, but not really a great plan for your survival. Back to the young family, the dad jumps in and then gets water in his mouth before jumping back onto the boat and showing that, he's totally boned. As scientists continue to explain what's happening within the bay, they conclude that over 40% of the bay is actually completely barren of life now. Again, they think it may be bacteria or some type of algal bloom completely clearing out the area, but they still aren't 100% sure and know that they are really gonna have to go diving down to see what's going on in the water. Back at the hospital, within 1 hour, the doctor has now doubled his cases of people with lesions and wounds along with missing tongues. They still continue to suggest it's a fungal outbreak, but that still would not explain the missing tongues. The hospital is in complete chaos at this point, with people overflowing the waiting room. In that room, the grandmother of the young family tries to warn them about not getting off the boat as something is wrong. As the family continues trying to go to Claridge, they begin passing empty boats floating around freely. Okay, so this is the part that kind of made me laugh like you would not believe. So they're interviewing this guy and they ask him if there's anything that causes sickness. The guy goes on to be like, well, there's chicken excrement, bacteria, all the normal things. And then he just casually throws in that there's a nuclear reactor leak in the bay that's not scheduled to be an issue for 5 more years. Like, okay. Then they straight ask if people are drinking the water and he's like, what? Don't be crazy. It's brackish. Oh, except for seepage in the wells and of course the desalination plant to make the brackish water drinkable. So yes, you turd Ferguson, people are drinking the water. I just don't get why he was like that. Like, dude, what? He goes on to say that it's really not his issue to test radiation levels in the water. So basically, yeah, seems like a whole lot of not my problem. JonTron be praised. So now things are starting to get worse. The cameraman is already exhibiting immunological symptoms. People are trying to nope out of the town, but the bridge is closed as the town is being quarantined. But what's kind of weird is like they never actually mobilize, say like the Coast Guard or really anything to completely quarantine it, because that young family from earlier is still coming. The FBI shows up to shut down all the blogs and news coverage, as well as put up jammers to stop anyone from calling out, which is why the mother couldn't get in contact with her daughter. As Donna goes that evening to continue recording events, she begins hearing screaming all over. And now we get to see exactly what's going on. The cops get called out for a call for screaming at around 8:30 that night. As one of the officers walks in, more screaming can be heard from the people inside despite the absence of their tongues, followed by force multiplied shots. The second officer enters as the people inside are basically asking to be mercied because of the pain, to which the original officer obliges before taking out his partner with a shot as well. As the Coast Guard finally gets mobilized, they fly over and see nothing but dead fish everywhere. And finally, the CDC joins the party. Truly, the greatest minds from 9 to 5. As they look on at a report, they find that there is a version of isopod that eats the tongues of fishes, but it's usually relegated to the Pacific Ocean rather than the Atlantic, but they have been finding reports of these type of parasites within the Atlantic lately. They discuss how they are out there and that the water is filtered, as one of them suggests maybe the larva may be sidestepping the desalination process because they're small enough, which I'm going to tell you, no. They suggest it's moving past the filter, which, okay, I can get behind that if the larva is small enough, but the water needs to evaporate to desalinate it. That's not carrying larva up with the fresh water. It's not possible, it's not gonna happen, but we all know what's happening here. On June 16th, we head back to the oceanographers back out at the bay. They dive into the water to look for the parasites that they're dealing with, and as they swim down, they reach the bottom and find some fish are being eaten by said parasites. The problem was, however, they swam right into a school of these things, and they are immediately attacked and then begin to be eaten. So now it's about 9 p.m. The town is looking fairly abandoned for the most part, and also if you listen closely enough to that water as they're walking along the dock, you can hear it's the same water effect that's used in World of Warcraft. But that doesn't matter because there's bodies on the roof. Also, the CDC tells the doctor that he needs to get his staff and himself out of the hospital, but the doctor refuses, saying that he has around 350 people that need help. Also, the teenager that was documenting all this, yeah, she ends up getting got from her wounds. As the mayor talks to the sheriff about trying to keep everything calm and contained, he says the police need to get this under control, but the sheriff has already lost contact with his deputies hours ago. The mayor says the town's towers have been shut down, but that should not affect the cops. Back at Donna, after her freak out about the body on the roof, she goes to a public fountain to splash water on her face, which, alright, is gross, and they end up finding a body whose eye moves because there's a bug behind it. Well, it's a crustacean, excuse me, and that freaks them out. So we now get back to the young family. It took them 7 hours to cross the bay. It seems like an intense navigation. Anyways, once they arrived, at this point, around 700 people have gotten got, and they end up finding a body on the pier and are actually pretty calm about finding a body on a pier. And now we get some scientists with some brain power. The CDC called in a marine biologist, and he concludes that the amount of chicken excrement in the water, the problem is that steroids are given to chickens to make them grow faster. And I know a lot of people are they're gonna go down in the comments and write something. This is just what the movie says. We'll get to that in a minute. But they're dumping into this water and has laden the water with steroids, which can make isopods grow by 50 to 60 times their normal size, quantity, as well as the speed at which they grow. As the family enters Main Street and they find the road littered with random bodies, people actually went to Main Street to get help. And look, all I'm saying is, in that situation, you lay low, like real low. You don't touch anything because you don't know what's contaminated and what's not, and you don't know what's contaminating things. But now we see the outcome of a prolonged infection. Finding the deputy's car, the officer from earlier stumbles to the back of the car, telling the sheriff and mayor to go away. He continues to threaten them, and the sheriff gets out to help. However, the deputy pulls the force multiplier on the sheriff and then takes his shot. He then domes himself, leaving just the mayor. Back in the antique shop, the family contacts their friends via Skype, as apparently the internet is still working, which seems kind of like a critical thing to shut down. But as they talk, they realize the husband is infected at this point as well. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, things are basically completely screwed. None of the patients survive. The doctor is the last one still up and walking around, and he knows it's an organism eating the people because it's eating their intestines, kidneys, livers, brains, everything edible, which is basically all of them except for the bones. And at this point, the doctor is covered in the rash too, and he knows he's basically screwed as well. So we flash back over to the mayor, who's now driving like a mad lad for really no discernible reason. I mean, I know that would kind of rustle your jimmies a little bit, but he's just like flying through the road like these aren't zombies, dude. Anyways, as he does, he gets hit by a car and has survivable injuries injuries but succumbs to them as there are no emergency services. As the husband has an isopod come out of his neck from getting water in his mouth earlier that day, it's not mega important, but his wife goes out with a baby to jack a cop car and get out of that town. We get like one last jump scare because we have to do that, which she ends up just straight taking this woman out. I don't know how she did that. All she did was shove her. I mean, structurally speaking, their bodies shouldn't be any weaker than a normal body. They're just kind of being eaten. I don't know, unless it just bit into an aorta or something. Anyways, and this woman does the smartest thing possible though afterwards. She gets her baby and she literally just walks out of the town, which everyone could have done who was freaked out by this. Anyways, the town afterwards is quarantined for about 3 days, and some people actually were infected but never became sick, interestingly enough. A ton of chlorine was then dumped into the bay to eradicate the isopod population, but at this point, the bay remains still 40% barren due to the isopod outbreak. So here's the first thing I'm going to say about the whole movie, just to summarize the events real quick, because it may seem odd that this hasn't taken place anywhere in the US in this universe, considering that likely this would be a common practice of dumping chicken turds into the water if you live near it. Growth hormones for poultry are actually not approved federally for any chickens. Now, we have all seen that picture of chickens back in like the 1950s versus the ones today, and it's an easy conclusion to jump to that we must be beefing them up somehow. But the reality is it's been done through selective breeding, sort of like how we turned wolves into dogs. Desirable traits were bred, which resulted in a larger chicken. In fact, when you go and you buy chicken and it says raised without hormones, that is apparently all chickens in the US, as otherwise it wouldn't be approved. Like, is that not wild? I thought it was a completely different situation regarding that, so you learn something new every day. Bear in mind, however, beef and sheep are still getting swole through roids. But regardless of that, so the reality of this movie is likely there would be no steroids in the water, there would be no isopods eating out the back of people's eyeballs, and we wouldn't have to dump untold amounts of chlorine into the water supply to keep these things at bay. Which, again, another issue I raised was the desalination plant. It literally evaporates water, which no larva is riding a water molecule up to the fresh water, but I digress at that point. But that's really not what this channel is about. I just had to point out the major flaw in this whole thing because there is also another possibility. The mayor himself was a little bit shady. The dude probably shouldn't have been dumping that many turds into the bay, but that sweet, sweet revenue, boy! So we can take an extra step here as well and possibly conclude that the mayor, having owned the chicken factory, likely may have been boosting the growth potential of his chickens as well and really just hadn't been busted yet. Seems like a dumb risk to take, but considering he was also running for election and was blatantly ignoring the fishermen in a fishing town and their needs, maybe the dude wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed either. So let's just assume that the steroids were being used on the chickens to boost growth rate. The pathway that this would take is as the steroids are given to the chickens, they would continue, but the anabolic compound in some capacity would ultimately exit the chicken and end up in a giant excrement pile. Once there, they would be dumped into the water and immediately dissolve within that water due to current turnover and movement. This would have a whole host of issues besides just giant isopods, but that does explain their generalized movement and behavior. Algal blooms would be the first to be investigated into, as well as bacteria. The excrement would provide the nutrients for algae and bacteria, which in turn would have some fairly detrimental effects on the environment and ecosystem alike. Fish would begin going belly up rather quickly, which in turn would impact the food web of the bay. Without new seawater really entering in any major capacity, which it is a bay, so it's pretty much protected, and this can also be seen by how calm the water is, this would allow for the steroid and nutrient levels to continue amassing within the water. The nutrients themselves are astronomically terrible, but the real issue is what affects humanity, am I right? As the steroids continue to increase in parts per million due to the calmness of the bay, eventually it would begin affecting the isopods within the water. The thing to understand about these creatures is they aren't necessarily supposed to be there, but with climate change and as we continue sort of like not terraforming Earth, but literally Panama Canal it, you just basically connected the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, this has actually caused them to come into the Atlantic, and we're starting to find them all over the Atlantic as well in real life. So just so we are all aware, it likely is coming through possibly the Panama Canal because the Arctic and Southern oceans around South America aren't really a good crossover point because of how frigid the water is and how violent the currents are. And this may explain why they're in the bay in the first place, because it is calmer water. Continuing on, these steroids would eventually enter the surviving fish and bodies of the isopods themselves. Being that it was what they were eating and also existing in themselves, it would have continued to saturate their bodies. So the first place to start with is really to explain the growth and what does a steroid actually do. Taking our bodies really as the standard since we are human, in and it's more easily understood. But basically, to grow a human, say like a bodybuilder or chemical bodybuilder, many different substances are being taken, but the main one is a anabolic steroid and something like human growth hormone. The steroid can mimic things like testosterone, which would be important later, and this can lead to a higher rate of muscle growth, better ability to recover, and more nucleation of the muscle as a side result from increased lifting. The human growth hormone is what actually allows for the body to grow. With higher levels of HGH, muscle is packed on quicker as metabolism is increased, and this can lead to good things like repaired muscle, healthy tissue being added to our brains and organs, and burning fat. The issue is, however, it's sort of like burning a candle at two ends. There are definite good effects to it, such as what we're doing where we're running trials and giving it to the elderly to sort of jumpstart their bodies again, which has shown promise at increasing late life quality of life. But the issue is, again, it's like burning that last little bit of fuel in the gas tank and flooring the car rather than coasting along. It has an effect of increasing the taxation on the body, leading to an earlier end. So when you are young and you go through something like puberty, your HGH actually increases. And when you get a little older than that and you're still pretty young, you may see actually a ton of benefits as your body is able to keep up with the amount of HGH. But ultimately, it has the ability to shorten your lifespan as your meat suits were never designed to continually run on something like this with the higher metabolism. Okay, so concerning chickens, these two hormones were likely added together, except instead of human growth hormone, it would just be chicken growth hormone, and this would ultimately end up in the isopod. As these hormones continued amassing within the body, the first effect would have been the growth hormone. As the name implies, the growth hormone would lead to a larger size than what has been seen in nature, and with the larger size, an increase in need for resources and food would have become incredibly necessary to fuel this size explosion. And this would go on to result in 40% of the bay being wiped clean of life as the isopods continued to eat everything in sight, becoming ravenous as their need for nutrients would make them more aggressive. The growth hormone introduced into their bodies would undoubtedly increase metabolism, making them do everything faster, from fighting to feeding to mating. On top of this, considering they are crustaceans, they would have to start molting more frequently to increase their size as they would to accommodate larger body mass. But concerning mating, there is another potential issue for these creatures. As the other part of this cocktail of hormones and steroids and all this comes into play, and this is going to be the anabolic steroid itself, which mimics testosterone. We know in crustaceans currently, there are specific species that have estrogen and testosterone, and the issue is though that it's poorly understood as to what these hormones do specifically for the bodies as opposed to say in a mammal's body. However, through research being conducted, the growing consensus is that it plays a very similar role in crustaceans as it would within other animals. With higher testosterone comes the need to mate. We see during the mating season with a lot of other animals. They will have a natural increase in testosterone during a particular point in time, which means it's time to save the species numbers and pass along those genes. There are some animals that will mate year-round like humans do, but for a lot, there's like a designated time frame. And this in turn can keep a species numbers in check, as all other times they aren't really interested in getting frisky. And the isopods, however, they too likely have a natural time to mate, but in a new area of the planet and now being pumped full of growth hormone and anabolic steroids, this would lead to a population explosion that makes the human population look like a joke. As the testosterone levels continue to climb in both male and female, this would increase their desire to mate on both sides, and this means that not only are these creatures getting larger than normal, but they are also reproducing at an astronomically higher rate. For anything in this area, this would be a death sentence. As the numbers continue to rise and the prey species in the area continue to fall, this would create a more aggressive species as starvation would become a very real threat. The isopods would likely be experiencing a constant state of hunger that would never really be able to be quenched as their bodies are growing out of control, which would lead them to hunt down more fish to eat and begin eating more than just their tongues. But eventually, this would not be enough, judging by all the fish floating on top of the water. Yes, eventually they would come across bigger prey, humans. Seeing as their population is pushing the other isopods within their population to new hunting territory at this point because of the eradication of their food supply, the increased aggression likely caused by the overload of testosterone in their bodies and the increased body size due to growth hormone, this would make humans a prime target for consumption as, hey, we don't like it, but we are made of edible meat. Upon entering the human body, a couple of things happen that would indicate that most, if not all, female isopods are pregnant to some degree. And first, if you ingested the larvae that are just littering the water water currently, they would continue and hatch and then grow in your intestines. But again, because of the added hormones, they grow at a much faster rate than normal. It also appears that, say, if they are on the outside of the body, they have the ability to burrow in the skin itself and lay eggs if they are female. But now something that should be known about this particular species is they're both male and female. When younger, they're male, and as they mature, they turn into female. This means every larva with its accelerated growth is capable of laying eggs later in its life after leaving its male form, which is exactly what it may be doing. And this is possibly why you see maybe one attacking someone and then so many exiting its body afterwards. After existing and eating the host for a while, the person will begin to experience a strange state of consciousness. Now, this may be attributed to the actual blood loss of a person and how they would be experiencing that, as the parasite does attach itself to blood vessels, but considering the organs are also being consumed, the whole meat suit wouldn't really be doing so hot. In other areas, such as the human tongue, this is also eaten quickly as the parasite attaches itself to the tongue, but now the difference is, which is noted in the movie quite a bit, they have no tongue, but nobody says anything about a parasite being attached. And this is likely because humans have hands, and we can rip the parasite off of the nub of our tongue, but once it's gone, it's gone. Whereas fish, they have no hands, as you know, and they can't rip parasites off of their nubs. But heading back to the mental status for a moment, I would have to say that this one is a little odd. Those who are infected seem to be acting in a way that is more like zombified than you would expect to see from panic, such as with the officer who takes out the sheriff. The question is why? Well, we all know the parasite is not known for its mind-altering abilities or neurological interfacing with the brain, so what is actually going on? Well, I kind of believe that this is actually simply a co-issue with the town itself. It appears as though those who were actively infected had also increased aggression, and this may also be due to the fact that they too ingested a cocktail of hormones that would go on to make them more aggressive and thinking less clearly, but this would also be coupled with the possibility of the larva entering the brain itself, creating a dementia-like issue within the brain as it was being eaten. The body would react to this by releasing inflammatory chemicals into the meninges, causing meningitis. Essentially, with their aggression higher, decreased thinking capacity due to brain damage brought on by the brain-eating larva, coupled with meningitis, this would make them react more violently to anybody around, as panic is thrown into the mix, creating less than human reactions to what's happening. So you see, it definitely wasn't rabies. What I find interesting through all this is the body does try to mount a defense against the invading organisms. The problem is our natural systems mostly don't stand a chance. It is mentioned within the movie that some people did consume the larva but never had this reaction. Now, the thing this could be is if they consumed a dormant parasite, it's possible that the isopod is not able to survive stomach acid if it's high enough, which it may just come down to luck of if you have acid reflux and you just straight up just dissolving everything in your stomach. But if they bit you and burrowed into your skin, you definitely do get infected. Whereas the dad may have actually, when he got into the water, been infected. But if you swallow it, maybe you just might get lucky and puke it up like the crab, but there are those who did get infected by just simply drinking the water. But again, it can still go back to your immune system. Many times medications are needed and then may only suppress it. With the parasite, the body can resort to inflammation, with the macrophages attempting to destroy them, and that's likely coupled with some eosinophil activity, but as these creatures begin to grow within hours of being in your meat suit, the immunity that humans would have would be quickly overwhelmed and easily, and this is shown when at first things like their joints were hurting in their body as it was launching a counteroffensive, but ultimately it would be fruitless as these creatures grow to several inches in length and then could eat the immunological cells from the bloodstream directly or sever connections by eating organs entirely. You know, the creepy thing about this movie is we already know the effects of growth hormones on crustaceans and insects, which can lead them to be fairly large rather quickly. Adding in things like testosterone, which in turn might make them reproduce more, could in theory lead to an issue of population explosion like any other organism such as algae or bacteria might, except rather than it being non-modal, it turns out to be an invasive parasite that after being altered to this point would become highly aggressive and now have a newfound bloodlust towards humanity. Although the simple solution would be just really put everyone on a water boil advisory, as well as just stay out of the water until the cause is found. But then again, what fun would that be?